This is the second generation Crane Whirlton toilet, introduced around the early 1960s and made up until around 1996. So some of you might remember my review on the Crane Santon. In fact, it was the first vintage toilet I reviewed, the third generation at least. And I've had nothing but praise for it. It was a very reliable toilet. Sure, the flush style was not very interesting, but it was still pretty good, pretty reliable, and even the flush was a lot better than anticipated. This is going to be the Anti-Santon review. So while the Santon was reliable, this is far from it. It's very unreliable and honestly pretty sucky. But why is that? Well, let's find out. So you can automatically tell this is based on the first generation Crane Santon toilet. And the first generation Whirlton was based on the second generation Santon. So you can tell the Whirlton came a little bit later compared to the Santons. As such, the design is very much similar to that of a first generation Crane Santon. So some of the stuff is carried over to this model, like design consistency and just the overall design and trapway design is pretty much the same. Now some people might look at this and go, this might be a Santon, but it really depends on the flushing style. If the flush is straight down, it's a Santon. If it swirls, like you're about to see, it's a Whirlton. Let's have a look at a flush. Now you can tell this is slightly weaker compared to the Santon I reviewed, but honestly, I've seen much more powerful Whirltons from this generation, and I promise you the flush really isn't any more exciting than it currently is. I'm going to be honest, for a swirly flush, it's kind of underwhelming in a way. It's been done better on a lot of toilets. Now I'm going to dive into the biggest issue with this toilet. First off, the quality control as well as the pulling factor, which is the two biggest problems this toilet has. The quality control is significantly worse. A lot worse. And this is the same problems that were carried over from the first generation Crane Whirlton, where sometimes the thing doesn't even flush out, and don't even get me started on the pulling factor. It is awful. Now the Crane Santon has good pulling factor due to the front jets, but this doesn't have front jets to help it. It just has the siphon jet, which is actually pretty big. You would think that it would have no problem pulling things down, but you would be incorrect. This thing struggles to get a lot of things down, and I just don't understand why. With a siphon jet that large, you would expect a lot better, but unfortunately it is very terrible at pulling things down, and it leaves a lot behind. Now let's demonstrate the siphon power. As you can see, it's pretty weak, unfortunately. And sometimes, like I mentioned, they don't even flush out most of the time. This one seems to be one of the better ones at siphoning out, but the siphon is still pretty weak. Now, performance, on the other hand, is fine. If you can get past the fact that this thing leaves stuff behind frequently and sometimes even shreds, this thing performs fine. But is it as good as the Santon? Absolutely not. Not even close. Now let's have a look at bowl rinse. Bowl rinse seems alright. Now, one of my main complaints of the Santon is that the bowl rinse was not that good, as it had straight down pointing jets. But since they're angled, the bowl rinse is a little bit better here, but it's not really saying much. It's still alright. And that is the second generation Crane Whirlton toilet. A toilet that could have been much better than it ended up being. Instead, this thing is a complete downgrade in comparison to the Santon. And unfortunately, this would be a lot more popular than the Santon, which was ironic considering it was the other way around back in the mid-1900s. But unfortunately, this thing has a lot of problems and gets dragged down a lot due to the many problems that it has, that they could have easily fixed since they've learned from the first generation, but they did not. And therefore, this thing ends up being a piece of crap at the end of the day, especially in comparison to the Santon. But let's grade it. The overall design is pretty much the same as the third generation Crane Santon toilet, so I'm giving it a 6 as well, like I did with the Santon. Quality control, unsurprisingly, is absolute crap. Two of the biggest problems being the pulling factor as well as the butchered siphons. The pulling factor is absolutely terrible, but we'll touch on that later, and the fact that this thing can't even flush out most of the time is kind of pathetic, therefore giving it a 3. Consistency is pretty much the same as the third generation Crane Santon. It's a 9. It is a very consistent design. The trap weight is also the same as the third generation Crane Santon, so I'll also give it a 6. The flush for a swirly flush is super underwhelming. The best way to describe the flush is like putting a tank toilet on a flushometer setup and setting it to the lowest pressure possible. That's basically this flush. Even on powerful pressure, it's honestly not much better, and given that this thing can't even siphon out sometimes, it makes the flush a lot worse. The flush gets a 4. The pulling factor is absolute garbage. I don't understand how something with a ginormous siphon jet has such trouble pulling things down. This thing is well known for leaving stuff behind and shredding like crazy. It's honestly pathetic. And that is in combination with the inconsistent siphons as well as the lackluster pulling factor as well. How does something with this big of a siphon jet not pull things down properly? It's embarrassing, honestly. It gets a 2. Performance for the most part seems fine, but it is nowhere as unstoppable as the Santon. So, is that really saying much? Performance is basically this toilet's strongest feature, but why does that matter if this thing can't pull worth a crap? But regardless, it gets a 7. If you guys remember my Crane Santon review of the third generation, you may recall that I said that the Bohrens is easily the worst part of it. So, how's the Bohrens on the Whirlton since it swirls? It's a little better. Sure, it definitely covers a lot more area, but I feel like due to the bow depth, I feel like the Bohrens really isn't at its top notch here. Sure, it definitely covers better than the Santon, but I still feel like it's kind of not too great given the circumstances. But it is an improvement nonetheless, although slightly. I give it a 6. The survivability seems mixed to say the least. While the Santon has a great staying power, this toy, on the other hand, does not. I guess some people put up with the terrible pulling factor, but if that wasn't the case, I definitely don't see these surviving all that great. I have to give it a 5. Let's talk about the overall value that this toilet has, which is not a lot. So what happens when you take an awesome and a reliable toilet like the Crane Santon from the third generation and you turn it into a Whirlton format? Instead of getting a great and reliable toilet, you're now left with an unreliable and inconsistent piece of crap. The flush somehow manages to be worse despite the fact that it swirls. The pulling factor is absolutely awful and leaves a lot of stuff behind and shreds like crazy. The performance is fine, yes, but is nowhere near as good as the Santon, and even the Bohrens, which is the Santon's biggest problem, is still left over on this toilet despite having angled rim jets. There is really nothing spectacular about this toilet. It's a pathetic piece of crap and no one can convince me otherwise. The sad thing is, Crane has experienced this crappiness before with their first generation Crane Whirltons. Those things had a lot of flaws and problems, but did they fix that for their second generations like this one? No, they did not learn anything from their first generation, and it clearly shows. The value is easily a 3. The final score of the second generation Crane Whirlton toilet is a 51 out of 100. I promise you, if it wasn't for the scores they gave the Santon, this thing would definitely score a lot lower. The sad thing is, this toilet had great potential, but they butchered it. Again, you would think they would learn from their crappiness of the first generation, but no. The same problems are still on this particular toilet, except the performance is improved. Makes me wonder how bad the first generations will be. Well, we'll eventually have to see one day. But it's already looking crappy, like how this toilet ended up being.